Good evening. Welcome to the Learning and Teaching Committee meeting on Monday, November 21st. It is 5:30. And tonight we have one agenda item, and so we will begin here shortly. I just want to alert the board members who are here that Mr. Kuchard is not with us tonight. However, he and I had spent a great deal of time talking with Dr. Igo about the benchmark districts, and he was very supportive of what is being presented tonight. Therefore, going forward, we have no citizen comments this evening. And as you can tell, I'm losing my voice, so I'm not going to do a lot of talking, but I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Igo. Dr. Gordon, did you have anything you want to say first?
I'm going to hand it right over to Dr. Igo.
All right, good evening. So at our last learning and teaching meeting, we spent some time walking through kind of how might we go about identifying and putting together some benchmark districts. And at that time, we had decided we were going to go with two sets of benchmark districts. One that was our comparable districts that looked like us. And then we were going to also set some for our aspirational districts as well. We talked through what we were going to put in place in terms of variables that we were going to include. And then we also talked through the calculations that we would use. Based upon that conversation, I took that information and ran the numbers. Okay. Dave ran the numbers, full transparency, to kind of tell us what that would look like. So in the memo, you will see that you have three kind of sets of districts. The first one is our comparables, and I gave you everything that came up. And then I kind of highlighted in red the two that we are not recommending that we put in our set. We were not recommending Huntley, and we are not recommending Edwardsville be included in our set. And mostly that had to do with, or Edwardsville really had to do with not really being within our geographical location. And then Huntley, because they were so far below the adequacy target percentile, we felt like we could get a better sense by staying kind of within that range. Any questions about the comparable districts?
Dr. Igo, you mentioned the adequacy target. You want to talk to us just briefly about what is that from the state of Illinois? What's the importance of that, and how do you use it, and how should the board use it as a measuring stick?
Absolutely. So the adequacy target really came about when we moved to evidence-based funding versus general state aid, and the state board identified 22 kind of indicators that needed to be in place to provide kind of, that would be the adequacy for all districts to have. They put some numbers to that, and they came up with the amount of money that we need to be spending to hit all of those 22 research-based items. That number indicates where we sit in comparison to that number. So we sit at 102%. So we're sitting really close to, the state says this is how much money you need to have to kind of cover these 22 items. And we have funded that, and we have that available to us. What's important to know is those 22 indicators don't include all things that we might consider as important for an adequate. Doesn't include things like gifted education. We know we have some gifted education, but that's not funded in any way through the state. So that's not represented in that overall total.
So are there any indicators that are not funded by the state but are included? So I think you said,
I see what you're saying.
and maybe we can.
You know what? I'd have to actually,
Sure.
I don't believe so, but I would want to double check that answer before I confirmed for you.
Would it be possible as a follow-up that you could provide the 22
Mhm.
indicators? Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions on the comparable districts?
These are all large unit districts.
Correct. So if you remember for comparables, what we put into our group was they were large unit districts. And by large unit, they had to have at least 5,000 students and 8 school buildings. to kind of put that system into play. And that doesn't take into account student achievement. When we did that, that was just student characteristics. All right, if we take a look over at the aspirational districts or the aspirational high school districts, we ran the same. We used the indicators that we talked through before in regards to, we used any district with a high school in it, as well as any group that had an SAT average score above 1,000. And then we averaged, if you remember, we did an average of the scores from 2018 to 2021 for grade 11 to make sure that we got a good representation. And so if you take a look at that, at the districts we have there, when we evaluated them, there's really only one district that we recommend that we don't include, and that's the ISU Lab School. And that's because that's just a very unique school. And it really would not be a good place for us to seek, just because the way in which they're funded and the way in which their students arrive. We are recommending that we include Indian Prairie in that piece. So you might remember Indian Prairie was part of our comparable districts previous to this. Initially wasn't on our list because we were looking for us to be one standard deviation above. But we've had some conversation and we felt that given that they're at 1.8 and they had been with us before, we want to continue to have them. So we did add them to the high school aspirational districts. Any question about those? Okay. You guys are making this way too easy for me tonight. And then finally is the elementary aspirational districts. And if you remember when we met last time, we struggled a little bit with that because there's so many districts and how to make this work effectively. And we really settled in on doing the feeder districts to the high school district as a way to do that. And even then, it turns out that there were quite a few districts feeding in, and we had a lot. So we went in and when we calculated this, we looked for a feeder district to the high school district that was also at least one standard deviation above us to make sure that we were continuing to be aspirational. So that is how this list of school districts was chosen.
As you look at this aspirational list, is there a predominant high school district that a lot of these feed into, or is it?
It's a really good question. I think the most that we had was New Trier. There are 3 districts from New Trier that were at least one standard deviation, but let me pull that.
At least 4. It looks like at least 4 of the aspirational high schools are represented. Stevenson, New Trier, 128, and Hinsdale are all represented, meaning that these schools feed those high schools.
Correct. And I apologize, I don't have that in front of me, but I could definitely get that information to you. But I feel like it was New Trier that had the most. And then at least one from every other district. Every other high school district had at least one feeder school.
So if you could, my follow-up question to that would be, if it is, say it is, let's suppose it is 3 elementary for New Trier, how many elementaries does feed into New Trier? What I'm trying to see is, do we just have a really spectacular system in the New Trier?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I want to say that there were 5 feeder schools for New Trier and 3 of them had one standard deviation or above. And the feeder, just to be clear, by the way the state does that, is 75% of kids from this feeder needs to go into the high school to be counted. But I apologize. I should have.
That's okay. 3 out of 5 though, I would say is still pretty significant.
And I do recall we talked about that not all feeder schools were on this list for elementary.
They are not all on the list. And because in some cases, as an elementary district, not only were they not a standard deviation above us, we were actually outperforming them. And it didn't seem like, that was when the first question came to our heads of like, well, that doesn't make sense to include that district as an aspirational district. And that's when we landed on the one standard deviation above. Sorry.
And I know you're looking, I don't think, I'm going by memory now, Oak Grove is in Libertyville. Does that feed into one of our?
It does. It
Okay.
feeds into Vernon Hills 128, I believe. Yes, am I correct? Thank you.
Oh, okay, got it.
Dave, you and I exchange a lot of emails.
Board, any other questions?
Maybe one thing we could do when we post this is just in parentheses somewhere, what high school they feed
Mhm.
into, so.
We could absolutely do that.
Yeah.
We had it like that at first and it was a little bit confusing, but we can do that. Like in parentheses makes a little bit more sense.
So I have one more question.
Yeah.
So to you, Dr. Geigo and Dr. Gordon, so how do you now that, this has been established, the tables have been built, how do you see applying this to the work that you do?
Yeah, for sure. So I think really kind of going back to those purposes. So that first purpose really, at least for comparable districts, is to get an understanding of how are we performing when we have when we look at ourselves across like students, and are we meeting those needs?
Mhm.
And do we continue to show that kind of growth over time? But also then when we look at some of these and we see good things happening. So for instance, Lake Zurich hadn't been on our list before, but they have some really interesting, like their scores are very interesting. To me, that's a district we want to go and
Mhm.
find out a little bit more about. Like, tell me why, tell me about that, tell me what you're doing, or let's see what they're doing and see if it's something that would make sense for us to do, not make sense for us to do. How might we be able to learn from them is really how I see us kind of utilizing this information.
Okay.
Yeah, I think from the academic side of things, when we're talking about where are we at in comparison to, and then those growth aspects, but everything Dr. Igo just said, including organization, how do you organize yourself? How do you look at, and how do you do the work of the district level as well? So those pieces will be included as well as we're continue to understand each of these districts in more depth. And really what it will allow us to do is really just focus on these districts and not the roughly 1,000 districts within Illinois, that these will be the ones that we use that lens in which to look to.
Okay. And then I have one more. So I'm curious why we put in evidence-based funding for the comparable table, but yet we've got the adequacy target for the other.
Oh,
Why
you know
would
what?
we
It's the
not?
same thing and it's just mislabeled. So let me fix
Okay.
that for you. Yeah.
Okay.
I will make sure when we
Okay.
post that it reflects that. My fault.
So will we expect that when we do or see at the board table curriculum development related work, that an investigation associated with practices in these districts would be included?
That would certainly be part of what we do. When we do our curriculum resources, we start with ed reports and we look to make sure that it's fully aligned. And then from there, in terms of implementation, we would look to see if some of these districts are also doing that. Yes.
Any other questions? All right, this is for consensus, just, we're not voting
Mhm.
on this, so we will put this in the hands of administration to keep us focused and on tabs so we can make good decisions. So that ends that part of our meeting. Are there any future agenda items that we do not meet in December, and we will meet again in January? Tuesday, January 17th. There's no school on the 16th, Monday. Are there any items that you can think of right offhand?
I don't have an agenda item per se, but I do have an ask. I'm wondering if we could get what our curriculum. I don't know what the right word, curriculum audit, or we could get the calendar or the schedule about when the curriculum all is due.
The
for
curriculum
review.
the cycle.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. I can put that in the weekly update.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Lackner, anything? All right, well, thank you very much. I wish you all a safe and happy Thanksgiving. Relax, because what's ahead of us is a lot of work and good work to be done. So thank you all. And I adjourn the meeting at 5:00.